The Winnipeg Jets are going to look pretty different next year. How different? Let's talk about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. As always, tonight's episode is going to be a fun one. We're going to be talking about some pretty cool stuff, or perhaps some not great stuff if you're afraid of Winnipeg Jets free agency, and that's fine. I think if Winnipeg fans are worried about losing some players, I'm not going to say I'm not either, but I think at the end of the day, it's time for the Jets to kind of go through a bit of a regime change, and that does include the roster. So let's start off with a couple of key things, right? Some big rumors surrounding two of our biggest players, Sean Monahan and Brenden Dillon. Before we dive into that, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more, because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, like I said, the Jets are about to, they're coming to a point where we're hitting a transition stage with this team. Winnipeg is probably going to make some major changes. I think the Jets are likely to cut a few players. I think that there's some guys that, while I would love for them to have come back in a way, I think the Jets are in a tough spot because, Winnipeg is in a place where they need a number of different pieces. The only way that you can really acquire most of these pieces is through the draft. And if you think about free agency, most free agents are not going to fit what the Jets need. And so for Winnipeg, I think it's a tough spot, right? Because you have a number of roster needs. You have a team that wants to remain competitive, but the reality is the team is probably a little further off than we'd like to admit. Lambert's going to be great. Maybe Lucius if he stays healthy, although we'd probably just like him to have a relatively full year with the Moose first before we start talking about his NHL career. Of course, Shiberkov looks like he's ready for the NHL. Salamanson will probably get some pro time here in North America before making the jump up to the bigger NHL level. And you've got some other guys. Colby Barlow at some point might be a pretty decent player. But I think if you're looking at top-end talent, right, the Jets are not likely to have too many of those in the drafting ranks. I think Lambert is probably one of your best shots at that. McGroarty, obviously, another guy who probably slots in there. But beyond that, you're grasping at straws, and that's where I think the Jets might be really reticent to let Sean Monahan go. Winnipeg center depth is obviously something of a concern because the Jets have a lot of decent centers, but they don't really have lots of elite centers. And I think that's where, organizationally, the Jets are probably not loving the lack of depth. But for Winnipeg to acquire, a better center, you'd have to trade for one. And that would probably cough up a pretty big trade package. I mean, if you're targeting a Strome or a Cirelli, should he even be available? I mean, it's tough. You're going to have to give up some really nice assets, which you then wait, chipping away a little bit at your future for the present, right? How competitive do you think a Cirelli or Strome makes your team in the following seasons? It's a tough call. And I think that's where, the Jets feel that they've got a comfort level with Monahan. Sean obviously is a pretty solid player. I think he did a nice job during the regular season, but I think in the playoffs, we kind of saw why Monahan and to an extent Toffoli, neither of these guys really fit Winnipeg's approach long-term. They were brought in to be part of a slower, more physical forechecking team, and while they did fit their roles in that respect, it got exposed badly when the Jets faced a lot of skill and speed. So for Winnipeg going forward, I think you really want to just get faster and have better passing. These are two skills that the Jets have definitely been missing. But if the Jets are trying to bringing back Monahan, I just think that's a mistake. And it sounds like Sean wants to test free agency, which I would say more power to him. He's certainly not going to get a big contract offer from the Jets. I think Winnipeg would probably cap out at like 4.5 to 5 million by 3 years. And, that's not cheap. Winnipeg would be asking him to be a pretty good second line center. And while I think he can do some of that, I'm not really convinced of the longer term fit. I don't want to commit a lot of money to an aging center who basically had a career season. And while he did have a great year, you look at the underlying numbers, you look at how he created stuff stylistically, and you just realize that there are limitations to his game that are going to be a problem for the next 3 years if that's how long you sign him for. So I honestly think in this case, the best scenario is for the Jets and Monahan to part ways. I liked Monahan. I think that as a trade deadline rental, he did exactly what he was asked to, and he was a bit expensive, I won't lie, but for what the Jets got out of him, I think that they were probably pretty satisfied. It is a little unfortunate that the Jets' playoff run did not last longer. I think you could argue that Toffoli and Monahan were only able to contribute when it was relatively lower stakes. And, I mean, it is what it is. A lot of top players for the Jets just disappeared during the postseason because, unfortunately, they really didn't get a chance to touch the puck much. So, it is what it is. I think would I say that Monahan trade went poorly? No, I don't think so. I don't think that would be a fair characterization. I'd probably give both that and the Toffoli trade a solid B. I think the biggest thing is that the Jets really didn't give up tons of futures. They gave up a couple of decent picks, but the Toffoli trade especially was pretty cheap. So I don't think you can really be too upset about how it ended. I think it's just a sign that there's a broader need for a change and a shift to get faster, younger, and more skilled going forward, which, that's probably an okay outcome. Winnipeg basically maximized what it could get out of this current core and how they approach things traditionally. And it seems like not only are the team staff kind of moving towards the future, but it seems like the fans, based on some of the athletic polling, are kind of moving in the same direction. There's a real hunger for the kids to get into the lineup, and I think that's a great thing. Julian at some point will be probably some kind of an NHLer, I think, maybe a fourth liner. If he would really hit his stride as a third liner, that'd be great. You look maybe at Reshevsky at some point if he comes over. Lots of interesting, I would say, fringe prospects who have longer odds, but could maybe fill out some of Winnipeg's bottom of the roster, while the Jets are kind of focused on building the middle six and top six, which, again, that's going to be a bit of a challenge. I think, you're going to have to see Winnipeg have a really big offseason and get very creative. Acquiring a young center who can be here for the longer term would be great. I don't think that's very likely. I think, the Jets are going to have to make do with what they've got and hope that some of the kids really start to blossom into something special. I think the same can also be said when you're looking at the Jets defense, because Winnipeg obviously has to make a couple of key decisions with a couple of the Dillons, and of course, Neil Pionk and Nate Schmidt, excuse me, mixing up their names. Neil and Nate are both wonderful people, but most likely one of them's not going to be a Jet in the following season. We'll talk about the rumors around Brenden Dillon and where that seems to be tracking in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, did want to shout out our friends and partners at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge victories. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are talking about some major developments around the free agent market for the Jets. A couple of players might be on the way out. A couple of guys might be staying. Two particular rumors have come through from Monahan and Brenden Dillon. And, obviously, I think a lot of Jets fans would like them to stay, but the reality is both are kind of more on the outs than I think most of us want to admit for a lot of reasons, right? I think the team needs to move forward. I think that there's some cap considerations. And honestly, the Jets have really been bottlenecked for a long time with a lot of interesting talent that could maybe push through the ranks. And I think Brenden Dillon kind of runs up against a similar situation where, he is getting up there in the years. He's only in his early 30s, but, by NHL standards, that's reasonably through a good portion of your best years. So do you really want to tie up a lot of money in that contract? And as much as I enjoy him, I don't think that that's the right choice. Before we talk about why I think Winnipeg is really going for this and who is likely to really step in there, just wanted to let you know, for all of you Fox Sports or ESPN watchers, if you find yourself having to turn down the volume with all the shouting, make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, for the Jets, I think Winnipeg has a couple of irons in the fire when it comes to some young prospects and players. They've also got some guys who have kind of been tweeners. And one of them that I think really had a chance to make an impact this past season, but had everything derailed thanks to an injury. We all know who I'm talking about. It's Ville Heinola. Heinola has been a guy that I've kind of been hoping would make the NHL sooner rather than later. And I think his frustration with not really getting a shot under Maurice, Lowry, and to an extent Bones, it's probably been a source of frustration and irritation. But I will say with Bones, I think Heinola actually had an inside track to a roster spot. It's just he broke his ankle. And it sounded like with his Moose tenure, it took a while for him to really feel comfortable skating at a pace that would be comparable to the NHL levels. So in that respect, I don't know if I count that part of it as much, but I will say that generally speaking, I feel like he hasn't really had much of a shake with the Jets org. With Dillon probably needing a pretty decent extension at like $4.5 to $5 million is my guess. The Jets, I can't really see them just sinking that amount of cash into him. I like him. I think he's a great guy and a great leader. And I think in terms of the player, he was way better than I thought he would ever be. I thought he'd be like a solid, second pairing kind of guy, maybe a decent number 4. And he really exceeded expectations. There were moments where he had some issues, but on the whole, right, you really cannot complain about his Jets tenure. And he was probably one of the better acquisitions the Jets have made. And it's funny because at the time we got him for like 2 second-round picks, which was pretty expensive. You think about those sorts of assets and what you usually get with those. I think DeMello cost like a second or a third rounder. I don't recall it being all that much, generally speaking. And Brenden Dillon cost quite a bit more. So, with that, you would have an expectation of quality, but he actually delivered. You don't often get to say that about players in the NHL, especially guys who come from other teams where maybe the system was a little more favorable. But Dillon, yeah, he was awesome. And so it actually hurts a lot for me to say that it's probably best if Winnipeg lets him go. I like him a lot, and I think of the players who I would be okay with extending, he's probably the one that I would say I'm most comfortable with. I think that there is a role for him on this team. I think he'd be very good for the Jets, but I also look at this team as needing to get faster, more mobile, and more skilled on the back end. And Heinola has kind of been waiting around forever for a roster spot. Now, he's not going to be filling in for Dillon. I think we all know that Sandberg is really the heir apparent to that role. Dillon has really been biding his time, and I think you've seen him take on more and more responsibility, and he's just been good for the Jets. I know a few years ago when Sandberg was drafted, there was some question as to what he would be at the NHL level. And his college days at Minnesota were good, but they weren't crazy. And then you look at the Moose days, and they were decent, but not crazy. And since joining the Jets, he's become one of our best and most well-rounded defenders. You ask him to arguably play really tough minutes, not that far from Morrissey and DeMello, and he seems to handle them when he's actually given that level of responsibility. He's just a great player. I think he's not going to be a guy who's like an elite top pairing player, but in terms of like a number 3 or 4 on your depth chart, absolutely. And that's where I think he honestly is capable of supplanting Brenden. Again, as much as I really enjoy Dillon and wish he could come back on a reasonable contract, I just think the Jets have a player who's already there, and they need to open up a third pairing spot on the left side. So if Heinola really is ready to make that jump full time and actually gets that spot in the upcoming preseason and training camp, I think that would be very good. I could see a pairing of like Heinola and Schmidt working out pretty well. I think Schmidt can be, the guy who's more of the safety valve, and with his lack of foot speed these days, I think that would actually work out nicely. Heinola is a smart player. He's got great vision and passing, and I think he can be the more transition-oriented defender while, Schmidt's able to relatively keep up. I wouldn't say that he's like lightning fast, but he can at least do the job. The second pairing, I guess you're going to have Samberg and Pionk. My thoughts on Pionk. I think it's tough. I know I was just talking about having Heinola and Schmidt together. My guess is that's probably not going to be the case, since Schmidt's probably going to get bought out. But if he's not, that pairing would be what I would go with. Dillon or Samberg and Pionk, I don't love. Pionk really struggled with all sorts of deployments. It really didn't matter how much you played him. He just had issues, and he was always relied upon to eat up lots of minutes. And so I sort of wonder, where the assessment here from the Jets is. Are they looking at his personality and impact on the locker room? Because if that's the case, I get why they would want to keep him around. But if they're talking about purely on ice stuff, his level of performance just hasn't been at, a satisfactory level. And in fact, it's been among some of the league's worst defensemen. And I don't really like saying that. In fact, it sucks. I like him a lot. He's a great guy. I think he is exactly the kind of personality archetype that the Jets love and really make use of. But it's just the on-ice stuff has declined to a point where there's no real choice here. You've got to cut bait at some point. And I wonder if Winnipeg has already started thinking about it. With Arniel talking about stuff like an analytics summit and making hard choices, it makes me look at Pionk and wonder if his days in Winnipeg are more numbered than they appear. But of course, that might all be lip service. The Jets might be saying that they want to preach an analytics direction, but perhaps they're not really intent on following through with that. And again, like when it comes to the personality and human side of things, it's not always that you follow the stat sheets there. But I think with Pionk, for a lot of reasons, you're going to have to make that hard choice sooner rather than later. It's a tough choice, but just like letting Brenden Dillon go would probably be better for the future of the team. I think you got to do something with Pionk as well. At least one of them is a free agent, so you don't have to worry about as much of a messy divorce as a trade or something would be. But yeah, it's not ideal. And I think if anyone knows it more than Pionk, they're probably lying. I think Neil has probably been keenly aware of where his game is at the past few years, and I'm sure it frustrates him to know that he can't keep up the way that he used to. But yeah, this offseason, man, going to be very interesting. A lot of opportunities to make over certain parts of the team and perhaps give some of the kids the reins. But obviously, with the draft coming up as well, the Jets probably have a couple of big organizational needs. We'll talk about which ones I'd like to see Winnipeg go for, perhaps in what order. And this is sort of prospect agnostic. I'm not looking at draft rankings yet. I'll start to do more research and probably comb through some footage to get a sense of who the Jets might be drafting this year, because obviously we're not going to have much until the second round, but maybe the Jets have a good early second round pick lined up. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. Before we go any further, though, just wanted to let you know about our friends and partners at FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Maybe you're feeling either of the Oilers or the Panthers heading into the Stanley Cup Finals. I know personally, I guess I'm rooting for the Panthers. I don't really like them. I don't like a lot of their players. I don't like some of the memories from our coaching staff having burned everything in Winnipeg and then gone to the Panthers and immediately had a couple of cup finals out of it. That does kind of rub me the wrong way a little bit. Not because I'm like holding it against Maurice, but it does sting a little bit. Regardless, though, if you're rooting for either of these teams or you just want to catch up on some action and maybe put down a few bets, you really could do a lot worse than FanDuel, because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, number of fights Nick Cousins is likely to be in, hits thrown by the Oilers, especially Darnell Nurse. Whatever you're interested in casting a bet on, be sure to do it with FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's closing thoughts, as we're just wrapping up really quickly with some final talk about pre-draft stuff. I would say I'm not really focused as heavily on specific prospects yet. A lot of draft rankings are just starting to be finalized and are coming out now. So over the next couple of weeks, I think it'll be a little more intensive, and we'll take a closer look at who the Jets might be after, because I could see a couple of different options, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about general needs for the Jets. Winnipeg's roster is kind of in a weird state where the pool has like a number of really cool players, but I think in terms of like positions of strength, a lot of what the Jets have is probably out wide. I think Winnipeg's wing depth is arguably its focal point right now. Although I say this, and it's not like we're talking about loads of elite wing prospects. They have a couple of really good guys, McGroarty, Chibrikov, and players like that. Lambert might be considered a winger, I guess, if he doesn't pan out at center. So that's a thing. Barlow, another guy who might be a winger. Maybe he'll play down the middle. Hard to say yet. I think he's probably a wide player, though. That's my best guess, unless his game really evolves over the next couple of seasons. But I think if you're looking at a couple of key things, right? Big one, probably centers, skilled centers with scoring prowess. I think the Jets should probably move away from some of the thoughts about having to draft bigger guys. If you have big players who score a lot, that's great, right? But I would say don't necessarily turn down a smaller, undersized forward who scores loads at the lower levels, because some of those guys like Stankoven end up being pretty good NHLers. If they have the motor and the drive and physical edge to actually play through the size mismatch, they can be really, really deadly. And I think players like Stankoven have shown why that can be really crucial when you're trying to make your playoff run. Obviously, it didn't end well for the Stars, but they got a lot further than the Jets have in the past few years. So perhaps they're onto something. I think another position I would really like to see Winnipeg focus on is right side defense. From what I understand, this year's class has an okay selection of defenders, but it seems like draft rankings are all over the place. So that's going to take some more research on my part. But in terms of just agnostically speaking, ignoring all prospect rankings, there's no mistaking the fact that the Jets' right side depth is pretty lacking. You've got better stuff on the left side, but the right side, I think, really needs a top-end, top four kind of defender. Obviously, that's asking a lot from where the Jets are going to be drafting, and Winnipeg's probably going to go for best player available, is my guess. That's what I would probably recommend anyways. BPA is always the best way for the most part, because you can work through some trades to acquire better players or guys who more fit your profile. But if you pass up on somebody who's going to be a great, either top six or second pairing defender or something in favor of a guy just because he fills a roster spot on what you think your future is going to look like, probably not the best way to go about it. You'd like them all to pan out, but you should probably focus on making sure that you pick the guy who's got the best ceiling and best potential from that position. So, the right side defense may be something that has to wait a little bit. I'll have to do some research to see if there are some underrated gems. I'm really looking for puck moving ability and some sound decision making in possession. Guys who can help with transition would also be great. Passing skills would be nice. That's why that Connor Levis pick was very interesting, because Levis doesn't really project to be a high-end NHLer or anything, but as a potential pro level player with some great vision and hands, I wouldn't mind seeing him at the Moose level to see what he can start to become. I do think there's going to be a learning curve for him, and it's not really been, much to speak about so far, but I could imagine him having at least some of the tool sets that I would really like the Jets to focus on. There's a lot of need for passing and distribution on this team. Not everyone on this team is bad at passing per se, but you can tell that there are moments where they've fired pucks blankly into opposing defenders or opposing skaters, and it's turned into a goal against. So that distribution thing is definitely a big thing. Skating is going to be a big thing. And if they can get a good center and a good defender, I will feel better about this pool, because like the wing depth, I mean, they should definitely look at some wings too, but it's a little bit deeper in that side of the pool. So hopefully the Jets can find some quality NHLers through here. If there's one thing I would generally say the Jets have done well over the years, it's at least identifying reasonable talent for where they're drafting. Not every one of those picks has panned out. The Nate Smith one kind of sticks out as having been a bit of a bummer, but hey, it is what it is. For every Nate Smith, you're getting like a Brad Lambert. So it ain't all bad. Let's just hope that Lambert becomes what we all hope he does, because boy, oh boy, would he be special if he really does hit his ceiling. And I'm hoping for that. He seems like a hardworking kid, and the Jets sure could use that high-end scoring punch. But let me know what you're looking for from the upcoming draft. What do you think the Jets should do organizationally speaking? What are you hoping for from free agency? Not that many of us are expecting or hoping for much, but maybe you have at least a little bit of a flame for at least one veteran player out there. Let me know in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's show, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with more off-season coverage and perhaps even some Stanley Cup Finals previews. So don't go anywhere. See you later. And as always, have a great one. Go Jets, go.